Hello everybody and welcome to Review Reviews, back with another test disc from Arrow Video. Special thanks to Tom, you know who you are. We're giving another test disc for the upcoming release for Ms45, coming out on the 27th of October 2025, the same day as In the Mouth of Madness, which is also getting a 4K and Blu-ray release. So I have another video for that already in terms of test disc, a little preview in terms of my thoughts and impressions on the film and some of the special features you get. And I'll be doing exactly the same on this. As my previous test disc review content-wise, I'll be doing the exact same kind of format in terms of giving a little bit of context, talking about the film itself, and then diving into some of those special features and giving you a little preview of what to expect on the edition and the transfer itself. And Ms45, released in 1991, directed by Abel Ferrara, is a bit of a cult classic film, bit of a exploitation, kind of rape revenge kind of thriller, very kind of Death Wish in its sense, very kind of iconic in terms of the imagery of the film, not just for the main actress itself, but the ideology of her kind of being in that kind of nun outfit. Really low budget, and it never got a really good release. You know, it had DVDs here and there, it was cut or uncut. It has a German edition, which is under the title, secondary title, called Angel of Death, I believe, which is the second name for the film. And I think it did get a Twilight release, I believe, on Blu-ray, which is a very limited kind of print. So this has not got a good release anywhere, really. It's kind of got very sporadic kind of Blu-ray and DVD releases, and, you know, whether it's like German versions or really ultra rare kind of, you know, Blu-ray US versions. And finally, Arrow decided to pick this one up, surprisingly, and release it not just on Blu-ray, but 4K and a brand new transfer, and giving us brand new special features and insights into the film that I've never heard of, never seen before. I saw this film quite some time ago now, and I really enjoyed it. And I went through a bit of a director's kind of, you know, deep dive as I got into The King of New York, which I absolutely love, Christoph Waltz. And through watching that, I've been really fascinated by Abel Ferrara's kind of filmography and really kind of deep diving into his kind of films that were available. Surprisingly, a lot of his films were very hard access and very kind of strange kind of releases, whether it's on DVD or streaming, and some do appear up on the Arrow Video, which is nice in terms of The Addiction as well, which I also previously watched, which now just have a 4K edition, which is great. Bad Lieutenant has now got a 4K release, not just from Kino Lorber in the US. 101 films have released Bad Lieutenant on 4K in the UK. Now, the review itself for Ms45, I want to keep it relatively quite simple. The film itself is basically a one big powerhouse performance for Zoe Lund, which is the star of the film. Is the diva, is the revenge, the angel of darkness, angel of revenge herself, and the star of this film, and she owns it, and she captivates the kind of the audience, the character, the ideology of her kind of get-up, her kind of, you know, in nun clothing, and rightfully so, not jumping ahead too much in the extras. The director basically says, even though it is directed by a man, written by a man, scored by a man, this is essentially her film in a weird way. It is her project, because without her performance, for her dedication to, you know, getting this right, selling this film, this hour and 25-minute film, the film doesn't work, you know, and you need someone who's going to captivate you for that amount of time. And to make the film work, all the technical aspects are great and everything else behind it and some of the supporting cast, but you have to believe her character, you have to get invested in her. Whether you like her or not is another question, but do you get her performance? Do you buy her performance? Are you captivated with what's going on? And I'll discuss a bit more about that on the extras side, but essentially the edition is dedicated to this actress and her life, being the fact that she tragically passed, I think at age 36, 37, down to drug overdose, essentially, down to her heart basically kind of, you know, caving in on her, you know, from doing massive amounts of cocaine. And it's an interesting you know, reflection piece in terms of, at this point in her career, this was her first movie. She was 17 going on 18, and she did a lot of stuff in this film which is really advanced, really kind of very adult. And the fact that she wrote Bad Lieutenant later on, which I didn't know that, I thought that was quite remarkable, with the same director again. So this is definitely her film in terms of just owning the character, owning that space and making it work. This essentially is Death Wish from a female perspective, and there's a lot going on in terms of the themes and the ideas of it, all broken down and analyzed and kind of given an impression on the extras side, which I'll get into soon. But in terms of the film itself, in terms of what you're getting for the runtime, as mentioned, this is essentially a borderline exploitation, rape revenge movie, but a powerhouse performance. This is a female transformation kind of performance, for the better and for the worst, essentially. This is quite a psychological film in some regards, I say, as well, in terms of just a mental kind of breakdown. You've got this very scummy, kind of very gritty, dirty kind of, New York during the 80s, and it's very authentic. It's obviously filmed, on the cheap, essentially. It's not a cheap film necessarily, but it's done on a very low budget. So a lot of the locations you're seeing is the real New York, is the kind of the grifters on the streets and the trash, and the way the film was kind of presented and where it shows you in terms of all the background people is a time capsule of the 1980s, and overwhelming male gaze in the film, where all the men essentially are just complete scumbags, whether they're kind of literal rapists or murderers, or they catcalling essentially, or trying to groom someone. It's this, the men don't look good in this film. They look really, really bad, and it's all through this kind of, a female's perspective that's gone through a really horrible, tragic event during the start of the film, where she's basically been assaulted twice in quick succession, leading to a murder, and then her transformation basically rises from that point onwards. She's a very small, timid, kind of shy girl who doesn't speak. She's a mute, essentially. She works at kind of a textile kind of, company, I suppose, a little kind of back office company. And, through this event, she awakens something very dark inside of her, something very nasty, vengeful, angry towards men, and starts wearing lipstick and has more kind of specific kind of clothing with the boots and the kind of leather, and eventually leading up to something quite tragic as the film goes along. But it's that kind of journey that we're going through, of this woman, and being the fact that she doesn't say anything. This is down to a performance, which is all kind of body language, facial expressions, attitude, being kind of timid and kind of vulnerable and shy, to kind of being basically a diva and a badass. There's a lot of symbolism in the film, some very obvious, some very subtle. Even the character's name is very apparent. Someone who is seeking that form of control back by the violent actions that she's doing with the gun, and her kind of image, and kind of luring people to her in terms of her kind of clothing and her kind of makeup and the way her expression is. And as mentioned, that performance is so important to the film, because again, if you're not buying it, you're not invested in what's going on in terms of this character, for the runtime, the film's going to completely fall apart. And putting it simply, Ms45 is essentially a powerhouse performance and a birth of an icon with Zoe, and she's absolutely terrific in this film. She really captivates every single scene that she's in. Her facial expressions, her kind of reactions, her transformation, as mentioned in the film, is fantastic. How she handles herself, and how she places herself within that world of kind of, crime and violence, and the male gaze constantly zooming in on it all the time, and how it basically snaps. A very specific incident happens, and she completely breaks down and snaps. And it's that journey throughout this hour-and-a-half movie that's really captivating and really interesting. It is a different side of Death Wish, essentially. As mentioned, the scoring is absolutely fantastic in terms of the saxophone work, the cinematography, how the film's edited, put together, the directing work, all very impressive for the type of film being made, and how it delivers on its premise, on its concept, and really kind of goes with it and goes for it. And it's definitely a very interesting film, and I think it's definitely getting its second chance, a breath of fresh air. Many people probably have already heard about this film for one way or the other. So with that being said, let's dive into the special features. Now, I've got to say, the special features of Ms45 are definitely the most unique and very tailor-made to this film, from the film itself, the director, and the actress involved. And usually with a lot of special features, and I've discussed this a few times on these test discs, and Arrow Video does a really fantastic job of kind of putting archival extras together, and some new special features involved in terms of essays and kind of deep dives. And you definitely get specific kind of sections of extras usually on most films, depending on what's available, what's been done prior. And the standard stuff you usually get is the audio commentary, usually from the director, usually from a film critic, and the standard behind the scenes in terms of how the film's made, trailers, things like that. In this one specifically, and some of the most impressive special features, which I'm really happy with, that I checked out and kind of dived into in terms of Ms45, which will be on the Blu-ray and on the 4K as well, is a bit of everything. You get the standard stuff as well. Specifically, you get some really good insights into the director, the composer, and the consultant, I believe, who basically helped make the film. And those three little mini extras really kind of paint a picture of what the time was like in terms of making the film, doing it for very little money, not doing it for massive amounts of money in terms of getting famous or getting a big kind of release, but just being passionate, being raw, hungry filmmakers that just want to make a really cool film, and getting a script that is so, striking and kind of interesting, and taking a gamble, having a very small amount of budget to put this together, and kind of just, using the talent around him to basically craft something together. And I like the fact that this film is not just a director's kind of, ego kind of piece. Essentially, this is a massive collaboration from the actress, from the composer, which talks about in the documentary, well, in the 7-minute extra, which is really good. I think it's about 7 or 13 minutes. Talks about composing the film, took it months to do, doing it for very little money, almost backing out, but being convinced that this director is on the rise, essentially. And this film feels different. This film feels like it's going to captivate audience a bit more. And it did. It was definitely a turning point in the director's kind of career, and allowed him to make other films, much like King of New York later on. And I like the fact that they just discuss how, themselves obviously were in the film, and they were scrappier, well, using the streets. And that transitions into the two extras kind of essays talking about the kind of the themes and the bigger ideas of the film in terms of the exploitation, in terms of the kind of the 80s kind of like time capsule kind of mood, in terms of Midnight Cowboys mentioned, and what the mood was like, this idea of kind of like the perfect America, and 60s kind of America, white picket fence, and the man goes to work, and you got the kids at home kind of thing, and you got this really dark underbelly rotting at the core, kind of late 70s going into the 80s. Things were really starting to get nasty, and a turning point with kind of the Vietnam War, and how this all kind of feeds into the actual film's identity and the placement of its time. Even talking about like, a Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese films. And there's some really interesting kind of extras talking about not just the time capture, but also some of the kind of symbolic kind of themes of a character. And, in terms of this kind of female kind of icon, in terms of her kind of taking charge, and what the bigger kind of ideas of the films are. And even though it may not be there, and it could be very kind of subtle or very light, it definitely has big impacts, and especially for a 2025 audience, being in fact how old this film is now, like 40 years old, give or take, more than that probably, and how captivating the film is. That's a really interesting kind of angle to go into. And then the kind of the final of extras on the edition, alongside this standard stuff you usually would see, as mentioned, you get two specific pieces, little kind of mini sort of documentary little extras called Zoe XO and Zoe Rising, which is a director, kind of documentary director that was basically married to her, essentially Zoe, and talks about a bit about her life and what happened to her, and obviously dying very young in terms of a wouldn't say drug overdose, but just drugs were responsible for her basically going from her lungs to her heart, and basically dying in a hospital bed at a very young age of 37, 38, I believe. And, shows what kind of spiral this actress went into, going from Ms45, at 17, 18, going to France, basically vanishing for 3 years, and marrying this kind of very strange kind of cult leader, essentially, and then having aliases, and at one point stealing the film apparently and changing the ending and using his propaganda, and coming back, collaborating, doing writing and doing modeling, and using drugs as a creative expression. It's a very interesting, tragic kind of 20 years plus that we would see on this young woman and this actress, this kind of massive talent, which everyone says she had massive talent. And I think that's why the edition itself is not just a celebration of the film, getting a restoration, showing a kind of a fun kind of exploitation film for the time, for when it was made, but also a celebration of this actress's life, in terms of her career at the time, and what she represented for a time and a place, and how the director and people who knew her and what she was like on set, and working with her collaboratively, and unfortunately her very young untimely death. And it's really interesting kind of specific kind of tailor-made extras, different compared to something like you would get in a other film. But again, it's just depending on what's been released, what's been made, 4K transfer. I do have the Blu-ray version. I would imagine the 4K will look even better than this. But in terms of a Blu-ray, it looks really goddamn good. And it's never looked this good before. It's a really well presented, clean restoration. And it's never looked this good before. that I've never seen anyway. And I think the team at Arrow did a really fantastic job of really bringing this film to life, and clearly had access to the original negatives and clean this film up. Obviously, still keeping that kind of the color grading right. It still has some kind of certain kind of filters and how it wants to present itself. It is a relatively cheap film for the time. But it's never looked this good. I imagine down to the stock they've got, it's probably never looked this kind of booming, essentially, in terms of the high definition, and it looks absolutely incredible. So they did a really great job in terms of the transfer, bringing this film to life, down to what they have access to, and I imagine the 4K will look even better. But in terms of the Blu-ray, it looks incredible. It's never looked this good. So that's been my thoughts and impressions on Ms45 in terms of the film itself, in terms of special features. What are your thoughts and impressions on the film? What is your favorite from the director's kind of filmography? Please comment down below. So in time, guys, I'm for reviews. Signing out.